All right, last week we were talking about the declaration at Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asked them who the people said he was and then who they said he was. And there was Peter's confession that he was the Messiah. Um, and in this account, in all three of the synoptic gospels, Jesus talks about being the Son of Man and also the Christ, the Messiah. So these two titles that are used throughout the Gospels are very important to ultimately who Jesus declared himself to be. The basis of all the Christology that we're talking about here is established in the synoptic Gospels. And so what we're going to do is take both of these terms and look at where the New Testament, where the Synoptic Gospels got these titles, what people understood these titles to be at that time, because have some they have some commonality, but they also have some distinction. And so they both obviously come from the Old Testament. And so we're going to be going back into the Old Testament to have a look at these things and kind of see where they come from and what they meant to people around Jesus at the time. So one thing I want to point out before I dig into this is that Jesus uses the term Son of Man a lot, and in a forthcoming slide, you're going to see he uses it way more than Messiah gets used. The interesting thing about that is it's always in the third person. He's never talking about the Son of Man in the first person. He always uses it in the third person, like it's somebody else. So it's interesting that that's the way he uses that term, which is not to say he's talking about a third person. He's clearly applying it to himself, but for some reason he always uses it in the third person, not in the first person. So we'll see that as we go through this. So why was Jesus crucified? Uh, he told the disciples not to tell anybody. Once Peter said he was the Messiah, and he told Peter that came from God the Father, not from himself. So, in other words, by saying that, he was saying that was the right answer, that I'm the Messiah, but don't tell anybody. And that's because the title Messiah was dangerous, whereas the title of the Son of Man was not dangerous. Here's an example of why it was dangerous. Mark 14. This is once they've arrested Jesus, they've taken him from the garden, and they brought him to the Sanhedrin. This was the nighttime trial. The high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" So they're trying to get somebody to say something about Jesus that would convict him, that they could use to convict him. And so they brought in these accusers. And verse 61 says, "But he remained silent and made no answer." So the high priest directly speaks to him. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man," again in the third person. "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." So, and this is what I mean when I say he uses it in the third person, because he doesn't say, "I am the Messiah and you will see me." He says, "You will see the Son of Man," as if it's a separate identity, even though he's clearly talking about himself. And then with that, the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. Claiming to be the Messiah wasn't necessarily deserving of death. But if you're not the Messiah and you claim to be the Messiah, that would make you deserving of death in the eyes of the Sanhedrin. So that's what they're saying here. That by claiming to be the Messiah, he was falsely doing so, and so he was deserving of death. So they were looking to find something they could hold against him. But the main problem here, they couldn't do anything about this. They couldn't kill Jesus, not legally. The only legal course to have Jesus killed was to have the Romans do it. The Romans were the legal authority. And they didn't just kill people because the Sanhedrin wanted them to. They killed people because they wanted to kill people. And so you can go around, and I kind of talked about this last week, but you can go around saying that you're the Son of Man because the Romans don't care if you're the Son of Man. They don't even care if you say you're the Son of God. That doesn't mean anything to them. But you can't go around saying that you're a king because there's only one king. So if they get Jesus to confess that he is the King of the Jews, the Messiah, then they can get the Romans interested. And that's what happens. So that was the whole point with this idea of Messiah. And we're going to talk about this term, Messiah, and what it meant to them at the time. So, the Son of Man, as you can see, is used with a higher frequency, except in the book of John, than Messiah. Messiah was a term that didn't get used nearly as much as the Son of Man when Jesus was. Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man. When we see the term Christ, it's normally being applied to Jesus. So Jesus wasn't walking around talking about the Messiah. He was talking about the Son of Man. And then others would talk about Jesus as the Messiah. John being written later and John being written more with the perspective on Jesus as God, Jesus as the Messiah, it kind of turned that on its head. But there's still, you see this presence of the Son of Man. Now, this other thing that we're going to talk about is in the Old Testament. So you see that the Old Testament has the term Messiah 38 times. This is where we need to kind of get our definitions. So in the Old Testament, in Hebrew, you see this term Mashiach, which is the literal Hebrew for Messiah. And it means anointed. So generally, when you gave somebody an office in the Old Testament, and that's carried over actually into the New Testament to a certain extent, when you give somebody an office, you anoint them. You take oil and you pour it on them, and they become anointed. And their office is given to them because they're anointed. So that's the literal meaning of this word, anointed. So it's usually a consecrated person, specifically the Messiah, the anointed one. So we'll see this term with some frequency being used in the Old Testament, and then that translates over into Greek, Christos, which means the same thing. It's the same word. It means the same thing. In the Old Testament, anointed is Messiah. In the New Testament, anointed is Christ. So literally, when we talk about Jesus Christ, we're saying Jesus anointed. That's what the word means. Like I said, the word Messiah, specifically being applied to a person, occurs 38 times in the Old Testament. And when it refers to, in the Old Testament, when it's referring to the future king and deliverer, the term that we're familiar with when we hear Messiah, that's what we think of. Anybody want to offer me a guess as to how many times that it applies to the future king and deliverer when we see it, these 38 times? It's 0. The idea of Messiah that we're familiar with develops not in the Old Testament, not with that particular use of this word. So we're gonna have to figure out how we got to where we were in the first century with Jesus, even though the Old Testament doesn't talk about the Messiah who is the future deliverer. But it does talk about a future deliverer. It just doesn't connect them. That happens a different way. So we'll see that as we kind of look at this. So we have early on this notion, even in the book of Genesis, in the very first book of the Bible, Genesis 49. Jacob, Israel, calls his sons together because he's going to die. So this is his last will and testament. He says, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father." And then he goes down to Judah and talks about Judah. So he's talking about each of his sons. In verse 8, he gets to Judah. "Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him?" So Judah will be a conqueror, and Judah will be a leader. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." So here we see Judah is going to be the leader, and it talks about the scepter not departing from Judah. So Judah will be the leader of the people, and the scepter will always be with Judah. So this becomes important because the line that we're talking about comes through Judah. After the Old Testament was completed, more or less, there is a long period of time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. With that, the Old Testament was being taught to people by the Jewish leadership, by the Jewish theologians. And during that time, this teaching became, to a certain extent, standardized. So when they would read Scripture, they would then follow that with commentary. So it was like a standard sermon based on based on the things that were being delivered. This came to be called the Targums. And these Targums would be recited. They became, so you, just like they would recite the Scriptures and memorize the Scriptures and recite them, they would memorize the Targum that goes along with it. So when they were teaching the people, they would teach them these Targums. It was a rule, I don't want to use the term law, but it was a rule that these Targums were not to be written down. They had to be memorized and recited. So there are some slight variations from Targum to Targum to Targum, but what happens in the first century, especially after the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was cleared out, and so things changed dramatically once the temple is gone, they decided maybe it'd be a good idea if we wrote these things down. So they were recorded then. In that period when all this teaching is going on, they were just memorized. But this teaching was very important because this teaching described what the Old Testament was supposed to be about. So here's an example. This doesn't use the term Messiah. It's not talking about a Messiah here, unless you apply this verse in a very specific way. The scepter coming from Judah. So the Targum for this, one from this particular Targum, and they all say roughly the same thing, is this: the transmission of dominion shall not cease from the house of Judah. So basically that's what that says. Nor the scribe from his children's children forever, until Messiah comes, to whom the kingdom belongs and whom nations will obey. So we see by the time we get to the first century, that particular verse was understood to be talking about the Messiah, the anointed one. But this very particular anointed one. So this is where we can make the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament by the time we get to the time of Jesus. This is how people were understanding these verses. Here's another example of the same kind of thing. So you remember the story of Balaam? Balaam gets hired to condemn the enemies, by the enemies of Israel, to condemn Israel, but he ends up not being able to condemn Israel because he's a quote unquote true prophet. He ultimately makes this declaration. He took up his discourse and said, "The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down with his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter," again the same terminology, "shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemies, shall be disposed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities." Again, no mention of the word Messiah, but this is the concept of Messiah. So even though it's not saying this is the Messiah, this is where we see that movement toward the idea of the deliverer, the one who will come. All of this coalesces, again, without using the term Messiah, whenever David comes along. So David becomes king. David conquers all of his territory. He starts to settle down, and he has an idea. And so we move now to 2 Samuel 7. Now, when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." So there is no temple. Going all the way back to the time that the children of Israel came out of Egypt, the Ark of the Covenant has still been in the tabernacle, the tent. There's just a tent and nothing else. So he tells Nathan, "See, I live in a nice house. I live in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." Obviously, God has blessed you and delivered you and given you all of this. Go do what you feel like you need to do. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I have commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? All this time I've lived in a tent and I haven't complained about it. So why do you think you need to build me a nice house?" Goes on. "Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more, as formerly, from the time I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares that that the Lord will make you a house." So here the Lord's playing off what David was talking about doing. David was talking about making God a house, and God here says, "No, I'm going to make you a house." And what he's saying is, "I will make you a dynasty. Your children will be on the throne." So God says, "I will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. You're talking about Solomon. Solomon would build God a temple. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So what does that make Solomon? The son of God. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So the promise to David here is, you're on the throne and your descendants will always be on the throne forever. Okay, so that is the promise that we have here in 2 Samuel 7. This is known as the Davidic covenant. God makes a covenant with David that his descendants will be on the throne forever. And also included in that was the fact that Israel would be established in their land forever. There is a parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 17. Now the relationship between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, in fact between Samuel, the Samuels and the Kings and the book of Chronicles, is that they tell the same stories and they generally follow the same path. They tell them in the same way. But there is some difference between them, and there are reasons why those differences occur. Now, in this particular case, in 2 Samuel 7 and 1 Chronicles 17, they are very, very close. They say exactly the same thing, especially in the portion that we just read, where the Davidic covenant is established. So you can go outside of this passage, and there are only a few places where you see this word-to-word correspondence between Chronicles and Samuel. What that says is that this was very important to them, and it was recited over and over and over again, and it became a very common and important thing. So this tells us how important this covenant was to them, even though there is some significant passage of time between Samuel and Chronicles when it was written. 2 Samuel was written probably either just before or just after the Babylon conquered them and took them into exile, took Judah into exile. So the Babylonian exile, the captivity, came either right after or just at the same time that 2 Samuel's being written. First Chronicles, on the other hand, came a long period of time later. It was clearly after, and a good portion of time after the Babylonian exile. So there's some difference here in perspective. So that's what I want you to see now. The beginning of First Chronicles is a genealogy. And it lays out this genealogy starting with Adam. So it goes all the way back to the very beginning. And it comes through the sons of Israel. And it continues on. So you see, by the time it takes a chapter to get to Israel, through Abraham to Israel. And you see the 12 tribes listed here. And then it talks about Boaz following Obed to Jesse and his children with David, the seventh son. So we get to David here in the second chapter. And then in the third chapter, it starts David's lineage and gets through his children, including Solomon, which was one of the four children of Bathsheba. So that gets us 3 chapters of nothing but genealogy. But we're not even close to being done. Chapter 5, we're still in the genealogy list. And it says, they broke faith with God, the God of their fathers, and whored after gods of the peoples of the land whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and he took them into exile to this day. So here, it's not talking about Judah. This is after the kingdom splits. So you've got the northern tribes and Judah and Benjamin in the south, the two separate kingdoms. And to remind you of the story, Assyria comes in and takes the northern kingdom into its possession and exiles the northern kingdom. And so Judah and Benjamin are still separate, and they're still their own. They're still their own kingdom. But the northern kingdom, because of they were, if you read Chronicles, you know that the northern kingdom had more wicked kings than the southern kingdom did. So they go into captivity. So here we are in chapter 5 with them going into captivity. Chapter 6, the genealogy continues. And it starts with the sons of Levi and continues on through chapter 9. 9 chapters of genealogy. And then we get to this point. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written into the book of the kings of Israel, and Judah was taken into exile. So here we see Judah going into their Babylonian captivity because of their breach of faith. And now the first to dwell again in their possessions in the cities were. So it then starts with more genealogy, but this is genealogy of people living in their homes again after the Babylonian captivity. So we know that Chronicles comes after the Babylonian captivity, whereas Samuel comes before it. Okay? Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because of this. Let's go back and look at this. He says when he's talking to David, giving the Davidic covenant, he says, God says, I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. I will appoint a place for my people Israel. I will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. For I will give you rest from all of your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So, at the time that Samuel was written, God's promise was being fulfilled. God had established David and Solomon, and there was a kingdom there, and Solomon's sons, they were reigning, and Israel had its place. Judah had its place. And then the Babylonians come in and conquer them and take them away to exile in Babylon. So we're sitting in Babylon now, having been exiled from our country. And yet, here's the promise that was given to David. I will appoint a place for my people, plant them, and they won't be disturbed anymore. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever. And yet there was no king in David's line in Babylon. So what? Now what? And so when the book of Chronicles is then written, it's with this in perspective. Because when Samuel was written, this seemed to be being completely fulfilled, and now we're on the other side of this Babylonian captivity when this seems to have not been fulfilled. So we have to figure out why God said this was going to happen when now we know something different has happened. And that's why these two different perspectives. And so that's also why there's a giant genealogy at the beginning of the book of Chronicles, because it becomes very important to know who's in the line of Judah and David. Because we believe that God is going to fulfill this promise, but since the kingdom has been broken in between, there's going to have to be somebody from the line of Judah and David that eventually makes this true forever. That's why we see this importance in Chronicles with this genealogy. And that's why we get to the point that we're at. So we'll take it from here next week, and we'll kind of follow through the idea of Messiah and get us to the New Testament so we can see why the Jewish leadership and the people were looking for a Messiah to come and fulfill this, since it didn't continue the way they thought it would at this point.